Battle of Leyte Gulf was the greatest sea battle that was ever fought. It used pretty much every kind of ship and weapon that was available at that time. This took place in October of 1944, and the world has never seen anything like it since, and hopefully never will. Now, in the summer of 1944, United States forces under Chester Nimitz, Admiral Nimitz, in the Central Pacific, had taken the Marianas Islands, and Douglas MacArthur's forces had driven up through the island of Guinea to the western end at the Vogelkop Peninsula. So now they had always been under divided command, these two different drives, and the United States wants to unite the drive for this final push against Japan. Now the Navy wants to go straight across the Central Pacific right at the island of Formosa, which sits off the coast of China. Today it's called Taiwan. MacArthur wants to go back to the Philippines. He had made this pledge, I shall return. Now, after a lot of debate and after facing a lot of realities, they realize they're going to go back to the Philippines. And so that is the strategy that they will go for. In about September of 1944, they decide they're going to hit this island called Leyte. It's right in the middle of the Philippines. There's about 7,000 islands, and it's one of the bigger ones in the middle, and that's where they're going to go hit. Now, they've decided that they will use two fleets to support MacArthur's drive. You'll have the Third Fleet, which is under Admiral William F. Halsey, and he is directly responsible to Admiral Chester Nimitz in Pearl Harbor. And he's got Task Force 38. This is 4 groups of aircraft carriers, about 18 of them, a lot of new Essex-class carriers. He's got this floating service group that's basically like an island of oil floating around to supply all these ships. And then he's got a bombardment group of 6 battleships that as well he can use. And then you've got the 7th Fleet, which is directly under Douglas MacArthur. This is under Thomas Kincaid. These are all the amphibious ships that land all the troops. He's got a battleship, shore bombardment group of battleships and cruisers. There are a lot of the old battleships that have been brought up from Pearl Harbor, salvaged, and are able to use them. They support the troops on shore. As well, you've got 3 groups of small aircraft carriers called jeep carriers that they have, and they held a small number of planes that then can help the troops on shore. So you've got these 2 fleets, and the 7th Fleet reports directly to MacArthur, 3rd Fleet reports directly to Admiral Nimitz, and they don't communicate. They don't have to. Halsey doesn't have to tell them anything he's doing. Halsey's job is to keep the Japanese fleet away from MacArthur's troops that are landing. Now in October, before they did this, Halsey goes and does these flights against the island of Formosa to try and knock out a lot of their air power. The thing is in that summer, the Japanese had made all these plans, because when Central Pacific forces took the Marianas Islands, that broke that inner ring that the Japanese saw was their main barrier of defense, because now American bombers on the Marianas Islands can bomb Japan. So they come up with 4 different plans, these show plans, victory plans, that in case the Americans go directly at Japan, go directly at the Ryukyus where Okinawa is, or directly at Formosa where Taiwan today, or at the Philippines, they'll have a plan and a scenario for each of those options. And so that's what they are looking towards. But when Halsey does those early flights in mid-October over Formosa, they think, it's going at Formosa. So they enact that show plan for Formosa, and they lose about 500 more planes. Now, it's only a week after those attacks that Douglas MacArthur's forces will move into Leyte. And they go into Leyte Gulf on about 18 October, and Soemo Toyota, who's head of the combined fleet of Japan, gets word, and he initiates the Show 1 plan. And this is the plan for the return to the Philippines. Now, what is going to happen is they've got a very complex plan. They've got the main body of aircraft carriers, 4 of them, and then 2 converted carriers that will leave from the inland sea of Japan under Jisaburo Ozawa, the admiral. And their job is to decoy the Americans, because they know that Admiral Halsey has all that air power. They're trying to get Halsey to draw off his carriers to remove that air power from that Leyte area, while they send all these battleship and cruiser and destroyer forces against those landing ships at Leyte Gulf. You've got Admiral Kurita, who will leave from Borneo on the 22nd of October, and he's going to go up through the Palawan Passage, through the Sibuyan Sea, into the San Bernardino Strait, which will come out north of Leyte Gulf, while another admiral, Shoji Nishimura, will go through the south route, through the Sulu Sea, and he will go up through the Surigao Strait, which comes right into Leyte Gulf there, and they hopefully will combine at that time then to be able to bombard the forces on shore and wipe out all those transport ships there in Leyte Gulf. That's the Japanese plan. The thing is, they have no radar, they have basically no air cover. Those ships for Ozawa only have 100 planes left because all those other guys have been wiped out during the battle for the Marianas as well as the battle for Formosa, all those Japanese pilots. So now you've got things enacted. And Kurita and Nishimura's forces are coming up. You've got another force under Kiyohide Shima that's going to come down and go behind Nishimura through that southern route. On October 23rd, this is about 1 o'clock in the morning, you've got two U.S. Submarines, Darter and Dace, under commanders McClintock and Claggett. And at about 1:30, they pick up on radar that Kurita's force, with the super battleships, the Musashi and the Yamato, the biggest battleships that have ever been built, with a couple of other battleships, about 10 cruisers and destroyers, are coming through this Palawan Passage. It's a very narrow area. They call it the dangerous ground there. Well, Kurita's got no destroyers out in front of them, and so at 6:30 in the morning, when the submarines pick them up, they just start plowing torpedoes into those Japanese cruisers under Kurita. Kurita's ship, the Atago, is right in front. It gets sunk. He goes into the water. He gets picked up by another destroyer, and they put him and his officer crew onto the giant battleship, the Yamato. Those two submarines, they sink two cruisers, and they damage another one. But while the Darter is trying to chase that damaged one, because they're in that dangerous ground, it gets caught on a reef. All the guys have to get off. They get onto the submarine Dace, and then they get pulled out. So now Kurita's force has been found, and this is reported to not only Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet, but to Admiral Kincaid's 7th Fleet. So the next morning, Admiral Halsey will send up all these flights to try and find that Kurita fleet again. And at about 8 o'clock that morning, airplanes from those American carriers, they find Kurita's fleet in what they call the Sibuyan Sea, heading for the San Bernardino Straits. They also find Nishimura's force down to the south, so now they're going to start sending planes to attack these two forces. But just as they're about to launch, all of a sudden, Japanese land-based air power, which is there on the island of Luzon, comes in and they hit the carrier Princeton with a bomb. And so that's right before they're about to take off for that. So now the Japanese have struck those American carriers, and the Princeton will sink later on during that day. But meanwhile, all those planes from those carriers now start striking Kurita, and the battleship Musashi will take, one of those super battleships will take about 19 torpedoes, about 17 bomb hits. It's going to be sunk that day. Another cruiser will also be knocked out, and at about that afternoon, Kurita will turn around. The thing is at the same time, airplanes had been hitting that southern force under Nishimura. And because they're hitting them, Admiral Kincaid warns his bombardment guy, this guy, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, and he's got those old Pearl Harbor battleships and the cruisers there. He says, you've got a force come through the south area of Surigao Straits. You get ready for those guys. Now, in the afternoon, Halsey gets word that they've sunk this battleship Musashi under Kurita. As well, they have sunk another cruiser there, and that Kurita's force is turning around. But also during that day, that decoy carrier force under Ozawa, the Japanese, had sent a strike against American carriers. So now Halsey knows that Ozawa's carriers are out there, and he decides to go after them. Now, during that day, he had sent out this message that said, I'm going to form this battleship squadron that will guard that north entrance at San Bernardino Straits. This goes to Nimitz and Pearl Harbor. Admiral Kincaid, even though it's not sent to him, he picks it up on the radio. And so everybody thinks that Halsey has created this force that is going to guard San Bernardino Straits. But when Halsey goes after those carriers under Ozawa, he doesn't form that Task Force 34. He takes that battleship division with him. And so now you've got this force coming from the south, and later that afternoon, they find that Kurita has again turned around, and he's heading for that northern entrance at San Bernardino Straits. Halsey takes off, even though he's got people saying they've turned the lights on in San Bernardino, Kurita's turned around, we shouldn't be going after this decoy, but they go anyway. And so now you've got these two forces moving through, and at about 10 o'clock on the evening of the 24th, all these PT boats that have been put in the Surigao Straits by Jesse Oldendorf, that bombardment commander for the 7th Fleet, they start picking up Nishimura's force of 2 battleships and a few cruisers and destroyers coming up through the Surigao Straits, and that Shima group is about 50 miles behind them. At about 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, destroyers under that group there at Surigao start attacking Nishimura's forces. They launch torpedoes. They strike about 3 destroyers. They strike the Yamashiro and the Fuso, the 2 battleships that Nishimura has. And then at about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, all of a sudden he takes those battleships and put them into a line of battle, just like they've been doing since back in the old wooden ship days, with all their cannons locking right on those Japanese coming straight at them, crossing the T. And so at about 4 o'clock, you've wiped out all of Nishimura's force. Shima comes in behind him, sees the disaster, and turns around again. Out of that whole force of all those ships that Nishimura and Shima had, you'll only have the cruiser Nachi, which gets out, and then the destroyer Shigure, and then Nachi will be wiped out later on. It's a total disaster in that Surigao Straits. Now, while they're fighting that, Admiral Kurita has come through the San Bernardino Straits. Task Force 34 is not there, and they are now steaming down towards Leyte Gulf to the south, where they will go in and wreak havoc on those beaches as well as all those transport forces. At about 4 o'clock in the morning, Admiral Kincaid has sent a message to Admiral Halsey. Is Task Force 34 guarding San Bernardino Straits? That doesn't get to Halsey until about 6:30 in the morning because of the communication delays that go on. That's at the same time that all of a sudden Admiral Kurita has steamed in to where 7th Fleet's small jeep carriers are. And they are in 3 groups called the Taffy 1, Taffy 2, Taffy 3. And Admiral Kurita now is butt head in front of Taffy 3, which is under this guy Clifton Sprague. All they have are these jeep carriers. They've got a few planes on them. And then they have 3 destroyers and 3 destroyer escorts. And what happens is those destroyers turn themselves right into all these massive Japanese battleships, these massive cruisers. They start launching torpedo attacks. They start laying smoke screens to try and protect those small carriers. Admiral Sprague runs the carriers into a rainstorm, hides them from the Japanese. The Japanese, unlike Oldendorf, do not go into a battle line. They go in a general attack. It's all haphazard and it's scattered. And now everybody's wondering where Halsey is. And even Admiral Nimitz sends him a message, where's Task Force 34? Halsey gets these messages right as he's about to go against Admiral Ozawa and all those Japanese carriers. And so then he's in this fight with the carriers, and he then has to send a task force of all those ships back to try and face Kurita. The thing is Kurita has now sunk the Gambier Bay, one of those small jeep carriers. He's sunk 3 of those destroyers and destroyer escorts, and he is now moving right at Leyte Gulf, but right at that moment, they lose the impetus to get through. He's afraid of all these American airplanes now attacking him, destroying everything he has. He's worried about running into the entire American fleet, and at about 12:30 that afternoon he turns around. So when Halsey's group gets back to Leyte, they find nothing. Kurita has already gone through the straits. Halsey's destroyed all those carriers up north. So now Nishimura's force is destroyed. Ozawa's force is destroyed. These guys had destroyed themselves just so that Kurita could get into Leyte Gulf to destroy all those American forces there. But right at the crucial moment, Kurita had turned around because he was worried about destroying his force. There'll be a big fight after the war between Halsey and Kincaid about who should have been guarding that San Bernardino Strait. But even though they had that chance to destroy all these forces at once, it's the greatest defeat that the Japanese have. And that afternoon, they launched on the 25th of October, they launched their first kamikaze strikes against the American forces. And from then on, that's all the Japanese will use, is these suicide bombers trying to hit the American Navy. When you get to the Okinawa campaign, you'll lose more sailors in the American Navy, but it's just because of these kamikazes. It's the last great gasp of the Japanese fleet, and they are totally destroyed in this action. So that's it. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. As you can see, there's a million books on it, and you can find them all here. Thanks a lot.